All right, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us today for our second entry into our 5-part educational census webinar series. Today's webinar is titled Understanding Your Population Tips and Tricks. We have another informative presentation in store for you, so thank you all for attending. As usual, before we get started, I just want to go through a couple administrative information and tips about the webinar itself. Attendees will be in listen-only mode. You have two options. Number one is to listen over your computer speakers, and the second is that you can dial in via phone. Just a word of caution for those of you on the phone, you may experience a little bit of delay as we advance the slides. At the end of today's presentation, our speakers will be conducting a Q&A. So on your GoToWebinar control panel, there should be an input on the right side to enter your questions, and we will do our best with the time allotted at the end of the webinar to get to all of them. And lastly, this webinar is being recorded, and at the conclusion of today's webinar and within the next 24 hours, you will receive an email with a link to the recording. If you have any questions or suggestions about this webinar series, please feel free to email us at the email address that you see on the screen. And so even though this is the second webinar, I see that many of the attendees are new and have not attended our first one. For those of you that are unfamiliar with us, I hope that by the end of today's webinar, you have a solid understanding of why we at Civis feel it's important to share our insight about this 2020 census. Civis Analytics, so we are a data science, technology, and consulting company. We work across the government, nonprofit, commercial, and political sectors to help our clients understand the populations they're trying to reach. We also empower them through our technology and expertise to create an environment of data-driven decision-making. So through proprietary data, technology, and advisory services, as well as an amazing team of data scientists and developers and survey science experts, we can help you and other organizations use statistical proof to guide those decisions and basically stop guessing. Regarding the 2020 census, this is something that we are invested heavily in at Civis Analytics. We feel that this is something we can't afford to screw up. So just by you being here, it reaffirms that what we are doing is the right thing. And we thank you for your support and your efforts in activating your communities towards a complete and accurate count. So that's a little bit about us. So this is part 2 of the webinar series. We have dates for 3 and 4, and registration will open for those at the conclusion of today's webinar. So again, this is today's webinar will take you on a deep dive on understanding your population. And today's speakers, who's speaking with you, so my name is Kevin Iaquinto, I'm the moderator, and we'll also be joined by Jonathan Williams and Sherry Shanker, who will be doing most of the census expertise content. So with that being said, I'm going to now hand this over to Jonathan.
All right, thank you, Kevin, and hello, everyone. So I want to provide a brief roadmap of today's presentation. This issue of understanding your population is one which we think is part of a multi-step process which will help you to maximize the self-response rates to the 2020 census for your sort of target communities or target populations. Understanding your population has several different components to it itself, and I want to walk you through those. And following that, I want to show you some technologies that are already available to you, either free or proprietary, which can help you implement those concepts we covered at the start. Finally, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sherry Shanker, who's going to walk you through a sample analysis that we've put together using software that Civis has been building specifically for the 2020 census. Okay, let's get to it. All right, so some of these steps may seem a little remedial, but I think they bear further, talking about just to set the groundwork, really. When it comes to a population or an audience, we'll use those terms interchangeably. The first step is defining your population. The first step to solving any problem is being able to name it or to define it. I know that many of the people on this call belong to organizations that have a very mission-driven sense of which communities they're trying to help or protect during the 2020 census. But you can define a population on more than just geographic or demographic variables. Populations also are defined on behavioral or attitudinal variables. And it may be that even though you have a clear geographic sense, of which communities might fall under your organization's mission or purview, you may still be actually dealing with 2 or more different populations, well-defined subpopulations that have crucially different behaviors or attitudes or demographics, even if they all fall within the same geographic area, for example. At Civis, we're of the belief that it makes sense to identify whether you actually have 2 or more separate populations, and then to sort of tackle them as separate audiences, rather than trying to combine all of your analysis and all your problem solving into one large pool. There's some benefits to this approach. One of the more obvious benefits is that different groups of people respond to different messages and have different concerns. So treating their concerns individually or finding the distinct subgroups will allow you to have the most persuasive messaging. And then secondly, if you're still searching for funding, such as from states and local governments, from complete count committees, the more concrete your mission, the more likely it is that you will be able to find an organization specifically dedicated to helping you reach those audiences. The next topic I want to talk about is defining the size of your populations. So many people may come into this with the belief like, oh, my community is the south side of Chicago, for example. And it's very clear to them that they want to hit everybody in the south side of Chicago. They want to maximize response rates for that area. And so with that mission in mind, it may be less clear to them that they need to know exactly how many people they're reaching. But sizing your population is really a crucial step to maximizing the total response. As I just mentioned a little bit earlier, your population likely has distinct subgroups. Understanding where those groups are and how many people are in each subgroup will allow you to really make a more efficient analysis of the problem and to solve it with the least amount of resources. I really want to drive that point home, so I thought I would just assemble a few quick examples showing the benefits of really being able to estimate the size of your audiences or your populations, depending on which type of population we're talking about. So some populations are defined geographically, and you might consider a state or a county being in the position of allocating a large pot of funds coming from a legislature, for example, having to allocate those funds to various LCCCs, that's local complete count committees. Knowing the size that each LCCC is serving, that's not just the size of the residents, but in some ways, more importantly, the size of the hard to count populations within those communities, allows a state or a county to be able to allocate the funding in such a way that they can say that every hard to count household is literally equally valuable to them, which might be important when it comes time to evaluate program efficiency and equity, for example. If your subgroups are demographic in nature, there's still a lot of benefit to knowing the sizes of the different subgroups. Civis is, for example, interested in Harris County, Texas, where Houston's located. And in Harris County, there are both Vietnamese-speaking and Chinese-speaking populations. But rather unique to the Houston region, at least in America, the Vietnamese-speaking population is twice the size as the Chinese-speaking population. When it comes time to recruit staff to help outreach to these communities, knowing those relative sizes, not just the relative, but the absolute sizes, would allow somebody to be able to hire up staff for those outreach efforts to make sure that they have the right allocation of resources. Another type of subgroup we could see are behavioral subgroups within your population. The homeless community comes to mind, for example. Many homeless people are housed on a fairly regular basis within shelters or other group quarters. Understanding the proportion of your homeless population that's housed on a at least irregular basis allows you to know when you go to outreach in those group quarters and those shelters, allows you to understand when you might be hitting a point of diminishing returns, when you've likely hit most of the places that you need to go to, and that further use of your funding and your time could be better spent trying to reach the homeless population in other areas. And then my final group I want to give you an example for here are attitudinal subgroups. So there are some people out there who already affirmatively do not wish to respond to the 2020 census. It's not just that they're unaware, it's that they believe that they will not. And they have different reasons for doing so. Some might have privacy concerns, for example. Others might just believe that it's too much of a hassle. Being able to size those two different groups allows you, if you only have money for one ad spend, to be able to reach that group of affirmative non-responders and try to persuade the larger of those two groups. So once you've defined your population, and once you've figured out the size, where they are, and how many they are, this is when you start wanting to bring in all of the context you possibly can. A lot of us have defined the populations of interest along certain variables. For example, everybody who lives within a particular county or city, or everybody matching a specific group of demographic filters. We might be looking at just renters or just young people. But whenever we create those filters, those rule-based systems for defining our audience, what might be less apparent is that you're also selecting or filtering on a bunch of different traits that you did not choose as your rules. To take one example, if you want to look at the population of young adults, say from 18 to 30, what you may not be as aware of is that you're at the same time filtering to a population that are more often renters than homeowners. Now, I think that corresponds with our intuition and experience, but extrapolate from that any audience you create by any set of rules is also creating an audience that is well-defined on other traits that you have not used for your rules for determining who's in the audience. So you need to figure out what other characteristics your target populations will have. You need to use all the sources of information you can to understand that once you've defined your audience by some traits or some filters, what other traits you start seeing in your population. We would recommend that you look at everything from the American Community Survey, the 2010 census results, open data portals you can find at various levels of local government, academic research, and first-party data that you yourselves might have gathered before now, or data that you can find that other people have put together. And although we at Civis are a very analytical bunch, I think this is definitely the slide where I have to echo the point that not all insights are quantitative, right? So talk to experts, talk to people who've been doing outreach in these communities, find qualitative insights that will help you later to avoid making a simple mistake, or will help you to avoid bringing your own preconceptions and biases to this population with which you may be less familiar. Once you've defined your audience, once you've sized your audience, once you've figured out all the context, or at least understood the size of the problem of gaining context for this population of interest, the last variable, and perhaps the most important variable to understand for them, will be what their estimated self-response rate will be in the 2020 census. We're focusing here on the self-response rate, even though there is a non-response follow-up or NRFU period conducted by the census, just because that non-response follow-up period is very costly, will activate fewer people, and maybe cannot be relied upon in this 2020 cycle as well as it has been in past census cycles. So knowing now what sort of male return rates you're getting out of your population will be very important to you, not just overall for your population of interest, but for the subgroups that we talked about earlier. Let's see. So there are a few different reasons why I say that. One would be you need to have a baseline by which to measure the success of your programs or your interventions or your messages. If you can know in advance what the likely outcome would have been had you not stepped into the arena, had you not tried to help out, then you can start to piece together how successful your efforts might be. You can use that both in the moment to hopefully guide how you conduct your outreach campaigns, and perhaps afterwards as well if you need to justify your work to third parties. It's also useful to get an estimate now of what the non-response rate will be or the response rate will be, so that if something really unexpected happened, some event or some problem that we have not anticipated in the census community, that we can start to flag that as quickly as we can. Developing a strong prior assumption will allow us essentially to understand when new evidence starts controverting those assumptions. And finally, a strong estimate of the response rates for your population will support a data-driven argument for funding or support from governments or partner groups that you might be working with. There are a lot of state complete count committees and city and county complete count committees out there who have now been funded to the tunes of millions of dollars. And they're going to look for places to put those millions, hopefully to help with the communities that you're interested in. But they're going to require a solid argument for why they should spend the amount that you're asking for. There's a few reasons why these self-response rates might be particularly hard to estimate during this cycle, the 2020 census. This is going to be the first time that an online self-response option is made available nationally. We've read stories in the news of misinformation and disinformation by both foreign and domestic actors. There's been a large question about the citizenship question, which will not be appearing on the census, but simply the conversation around it might have created a pressure for non-response. There's also been a lot of demographic changes since 2010. The population has changed, drifted. Immigration, the graying of America, moves from the more rural areas to the cities. All these trends were in flight in 2010 and have continued into 2020. And so we can't just rely upon what people did in 2010 to help us understand what will happen in 2020. And finally, there may be simple attitudinal shifts around whether the census is everybody's civic responsibility to fill out. There's so much survey research going on these days that surveying itself might have created sort of essentially, people might be fatigued. There are so many surveys being put out into the field that you might see a fatigue that affects the census, which is arguably the most important survey to fill out. But if you've already filled out so many or been approached by so many people, it might create a challenge. Okay, so that's basically the concepts that I want to cover. What goes into understanding your population? And I hope I've highlighted how there are some unique challenges this cycle. But happily, there's also some technologies that are going to be able to help us to do the best job we can in preparation for the 2020 census. One tool which we showed briefly in the last webinar, in which I want to highlight here again, comes from the City Universities of New York. The CUNY Census 2020 HTC, that's hard to count, mapping tool is free, it's open source, and it provides very detailed tract-level information about the possible response rates and other demographic characteristics of every tract and county in the nation. It's put together by census professionals, people who have long worked with census data, and it relies upon Census Bureau research. So I'm showing here a video of a simple use of the CUNY tool to first look at Wayne County, Michigan, that's where Detroit is, and then perhaps to drill down to a specific census tract that's particularly hard to count. This tract poses a real challenge. Only 20% of households in this tract mailed back their form in 2010. And we can start to see why when we use this tool to understand the sort of specific demographic factors. Most saliently, almost everybody in this tract is a renter. You can see here that 98% of the tract's households are renter occupied as opposed to home owned. I encourage you to play around with this tool more yourself. It's free to use. It's available at the link we show here. It focuses on displaying the 2010 mail return rates, and the color coding you see in the orange and red focuses on tracts that in 2010 were in the bottom 20% for self-response. I want to contrast that to a second tool, this one made by the Census Bureau itself, called ROAM, for Response Outreach Area Mapper. The ROAM tool behaves quite similarly. I've pulled up the same county, Wayne County in Michigan, and we can even look at the same tract if we wanted to. But importantly, it's plotting different information and allows you to add on different layers. For example, here I'm adding a layer that shows the segmentation that the Census Bureau did, which groups every tract in America into one of a certain number of categories. You can also start adding layers such as school districts, legislative districts, zip codes, to help you understand how these boundaries, which don't always match up with census boundaries, overlap with your populations. You can also pull up the underlying census data itself, which you can see at the bottom here, and find more information going beyond just the one or two variables which it's possible to plot on a map at the same time. You can even export that information to a CSV if you would like. So this tool is also free to use. It's available through the Census Bureau's website. And instead of plotting the 2010 response rates, that's the self-response rates, it uses the Census Bureau's LRS, or low response score, which is a predicted measure of the 2020 self-response rate. That's a large salient difference between the ROAM tool that the Census Bureau provides and the CUNY hard to count map. I would say that even though the 2010 self-response rates, which the CUNY map provides, will certainly be different this time around in 2020, it's also unclear whether the low response scores that the Census Bureau has put out will definitely be a precise estimate of the 2020 response rates, given the unique challenges for this cycle. My personal belief, and you're free to use these tools yourselves and come to your own conclusions, is that while the census tool, the ROAM tool, provides somewhat more information, the CUNY tool does a better job of surfacing it for a decision maker or helping you to understand a problem more quickly. There's a little bit more of the human in the loop with the CUNY tool. However, whichever one you use, I want you to feel confident that they're saying the same things. They both rely upon the same underlying census information. On this slide, I have on the left the Census ROAM tool for that one tract in Detroit, which we were looking at, and on the right, the CUNY hard to count map for the same tract in Wayne County. And I just want to highlight that the data that they're pulling from is the same thing. They have the same population, the same 2010 mail return rate. These are consistent tools, and you should feel free to move between them without worrying about introducing apples to oranges comparisons. That's a good segue into the direction I think you need to go as you advance your understanding of your populations. Mapping tools are very helpful for forming hypotheses and understanding the scale of a problem, but they don't allow you to make evidence-based decisions very well. You really need to start doing your own research or partnering with organizations which will do their own research. So the data that you will need to find mostly comes from the Census Bureau, although of course, any extra information you have, first party, third party, local, private, public, all the context you can get is helpful, but I believe the foundation will be census data. So that includes the 2010 census results, the American Community Survey results, and the 2019 planning database, which is what the Census Bureau uses as it prepares for the 2020 census. That planning database will have a large number of data sets and documentation that you can look at and download as flat files or CSVs, Excels, etc., and start to work with yourself. But rather than downloading a large Excel spreadsheet, which will then start you on a path which takes many, many hours of manual labor, at Civis, we would recommend that you start finding ways to automate this analysis wherever you can. Make it replicable, make it portable, so you can send it to different organizations and have them start doing the same things you did without having to put in the same amount of work. Make it faster than working with a large 50 megabyte Excel file, for example. There are a lot of ways to do this. You can use statistical software out there, such as R or Python, to do your analysis of the Census Bureau data. You can actually pull the Census Bureau data that you're looking for directly from the Census Bureau itself without going through the whole summary files using an API, which is simply a method of accessing the various rows and columns you're looking for directly. You can start to set up automated workflows with various tools. Civis provides some itself that allow you to essentially revise and share your analyses and collaborate with others who are working on similar problems. The more advanced analysis you can throw at your problems, the more likely you will be able to find the insights which allow you to have the most success in the 2020 census cycle. So we believe that off-the-shelf analysis can only bring you so far. You're really looking for custom research specific to your population, conducted under your auspices or direction. Maybe your organization is able to do that. Maybe you need to find a partner organization who can help you with this. But whatever the case, it's kind of unlikely that somewhere out there somebody has done all of the work that you need and it just needs to be found. You'll probably have to start some of this, put it into process yourself. We think of the analysis of flywheel, essentially at Civis, as moving between the population, an analytics team, and the decision makers. The population generates data, which an analytics team can study and repackage as insights to the decision makers. The decision makers, in turn, create policy actions which affect the communities and the population, generating new data, and then you iterate. So that's the plan. That's the method that we think is going to bring you the most success. We encourage all local governments, all outreach organizations, everybody interested in the 2020 census to invest in analytics teams at some level, in-house, out-house, whatever works for you. At Civis, we're here to help. We've been working on custom census software that will help you to understand your audiences just in the way that I've explained here in the presentation today. And I'm going to have my colleague, Sherry, show you that software in just a minute. But I don't want to turn you off with the idea that this is just about a pitch. This presentation, this series of webinars is really about the education. And we really firmly believe that if you go somewhere else for your analysis, whether you do it in-house or you find other groups out there willing to work with you, what we're invested in is bringing data science, bringing solid, credible, quantitative methods to helping this problem of maximizing the self-response. And we'll be thrilled if you play any part of that story. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sherry.
Thanks, Jonathan. So now that Jonathan has shown a lot of these different tools that are out there and the things that we want to keep in mind, I'm going to try to show how you can kind of bring all of these things together in a specific geography to start thinking about engagement for the census. So the geography that we're going to use for this example is Harris County, Texas. So a little bit of context on Harris County. It's the third largest county in the US with a population of 4.3 million and includes the city of Houston and its metro area. And about half of that population lives outside of Houston. So within Harris County, some areas are going to be harder to count than others. So here is a screenshot from the CUNY tool that we showed earlier with the 2010 mail return rates plotted for every tract. And we can see that there are some tracts that are had much lower return rates than others, so likely we'll want to focus on those. So with that context, we want to think about what is a specific population within Harris County that we can do specific census engagement with to make sure that we're able to count those the best. So one specific challenge in Harris County that's common across the US is that there are a lot of households which are limited English speaking. So in Harris County, 12% of households are limited English speaking, and 82% of those primarily speak Spanish in the home. And there's been a lot of research on this, and those households are harder to count in the census and in other surveys due to the language barrier and lower trust and so on. So we want to make sure that when different community partners and organizations are planning their engagement, they are focusing on those populations and specifically how to reach those. So kind of with that context, the first thing that we want to do is just understand how many of these limited English Spanish-speaking households are there in Harris County, and generally where can we find them? So there's a lot of different ways to do this. You could go on the census website and use the fact finder. I'm going to show one way to do this using some code because that's the way that I like to do it. You can generalize it for another state or another county. So here I'm using the Tidy Census package, which works with an R script, and I'm able to actually connect to the Census API that Jonathan showed to pull the exact data that we want. So with this 20 lines of code, we can generate a table that looks like this and find that there's about 150,000 limited English Spanish-speaking households in Harris County. And the majority of those are in Houston, but they're also kind of sizable populations outside of that. So now that we have kind of a general sense of the audience and where it is, we want to start really drilling down to define exactly where we can find them and what else we know about them. So, and we've talked a lot about audience and population. So the first thing I want to do is make sure we're clear exactly what we mean by that in this case. So sometimes an audience at Civis can mean a group of specific individuals. Sometimes it can mean something else. In the case of the census, what actually makes sense for an audience is a set of geographies, since as a community partner or someone in a city government, you can't go and target specific individuals. What you really want to know is where should I go to have the highest chance of finding the population that I care about, the most hard to count people. So you could use different geographies for this. You could use neighborhoods, census tracts, census blocks. I'm going to show specifically census tracts for this example. So thinking about this Spanish-speaking population, I'm going to use two filters to define the tracts that we care about. So all census tracts where the percent of households that are non-English speaking is 50 or above, and the households tracts where the percent of people who are specifically Spanish speaking is also 50 or above. So you can see in this video that after applying those two filters, we're left with just the set of tracts where we meet these two criteria. And that's obviously much smaller than all of Harris County. So now we can really focus in. And we can actually see in Census Intelligence Center what the approximate audience size is. So how many people live in those census tracts, and it's about 200,000 people. So we've defined our audience, we know where we can find them. Now we want to understand what else do we know about them as we start to plan outreach. So in Census Intelligence Center, something really nice that you can do is compare any audience to another audience that you've defined. So in this case, I've created a Harris County overall audience with just all the census tracts in a Harris County, and that lets me compare between the two. So this is really important because you want to have the right benchmark, right? Just knowing that a population has a lot of young people or a lot of non-US citizens isn't as valuable as knowing that my specific subpopulation is especially likely to have those types of people when I'm thinking about outreach. So there's a lot of different variables that we could look at. One that I thought was especially important was the type of housing that the people have in our population. And we see that for these census tracts that are heavily Spanish speaking, also more likely to have people living in rental units. So not everyone is going to be a renter in these tracts, of course, but as someone doing the work on the ground to collect census responses, when they're thinking about how to target the people in these census tracts, not only should you be thinking about how do I make sure that I can connect with people who are more likely to be Spanish speakers, but also how can I design my outreach and engagement to account for the fact that a lot of people are going to be renters, they're going to be more mobile, living in different types of housing than others that makes them more difficult to reach. So like Jonathan said, thinking both about these kind of explicit definitions, so non-English Spanish speakers, and also these implicit variables like what kind of housing do these people have, what age ranges are they more likely to fall in, really helps you design the most effective outreach. So we have a broad sense of our audience. We know where they are and what defines them. But at the same time, we want to acknowledge that even within this small audience of maybe 20 or 30 census tracts, there's a lot of differences between them. So here's just the map of the tracts that we identified, and they're colored by their hard to count scores. So that's based on the low response score from the census planning database. So you can see that within this, there's some tracts are very dark navy, those are harder to count, and some are lighter. And when we start looking at the actual data about the tracts, we can understand what is causing that variation. So if we look at this tract in the north part of Houston, we can see that there are about 30% of units there are rental units, and there's about 28% of people living below the poverty level. And there the hard to count score is about 30%. So this is pretty high, but not as high as this other tract that we're going to look at. So then if we go down to the southwest part of Harris County, there's this really small tract, though it's very dense. The population is actually much larger than the first tract we were looking at. And here, the percent of rental units is 100%, and almost twice as many people are below the poverty level. And this tract also, not surprisingly, has a higher hard to count score, which is likely related to the fact that there's more rental units and more people living in poverty. So as we're trying to think about engagement and outreach on the ground, both want to think about the population overall, but then also think about when you're going to a specific location, what defines that exact neighborhood or census tract, and how do I put the right amount of resources and the right resources towards that area. So maps are really useful for kind of getting the lay of the land and being able to explore, but we want to make sure that we're also really making this data actionable to the people that we're providing it to and who need to be able to start going out and making sure you're collecting the information you need. So in Census Intelligence Center, one really nice thing that you can do is actually save your audience. This means that you can come back to it later and make edits and continue exploring. It also means that you can actually export the audience that you've designed or defined and start using that to make decisions. So here I've just exported it to an Excel file, and here we have one row for every tract that met those filter criteria that we've defined, and then some information about each of those tracts. So we've included the percent of people that are hard to count, and then also Spanish speakers below the poverty level, and you could add a lot of other data here. And one thing I wanted to point out here is that, oftentimes, resources are really limited, and it's really difficult to kind of have enough people to go and engage with people in all of these tracts. And deciding on how much resources to put in different places and where to go first is kind of a really difficult and complicated question. But one way you could do that is by prioritizing the ones that have the highest share of hard to count people first. So one way you could kind of look at this data is by ordering it by how hard to count each tract is, which is what we've done here. So finally, want to say that kind of this quantitative information is a really good place to start. We have a really distinct list of census tracts. we know some really specific information about them that gives us a good idea of how to start thinking about engagement. But it's likely that once you're really ready to hit the ground, you're going to actually want even more information. So not only who these people are, but how should we actually talk to them? So for example, what is the best message to use to persuade the people in a particular census tract to respond to the census? And also maybe what messages should we avoid because it's going to actually make people less likely to respond? So we're not going to get into this kind of messaging today. It's going to be the subject of one of the future webinars, but we did want to show how kind of this first set of information, just the locations and the basic information, and then you can build on this to start really understanding your audience and how to reach them.
All right, thanks, Sherry and Jonathan. Appreciate all the great content there. I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Sherry had mentioned at the end there, that in our next webinar, which will be webinar number 3 of this series, we will be doing a deep dive into how you can kind of apply this data into the proper messaging and assigning the proper messaging and testing the right messaging to your audiences. So that will be on October 31st, and we will open registration for that shortly after this webinar closes. But now I want to kind of transition into the Q&A portion of the webinar here. So we do have some questions that did come in. We'll try to get to them as often as, or as many of them as we can within the next 18 minutes or so. So the first question is, how do you define the homeless populations for the Intelligence Center?
Sure, I'll take that. This is Jonathan again. Homeless populations inherently are not easily tied to particular tracts. For working with homeless populations, you need to essentially reach out to the organizations involved with those particular continuums of care, as they're known, COCs, and you'll be able to upload any data that they have directly into your analysis. For example, the Census Intelligence Center that we've been demoing allows groups to upload their own data. Now, they may not be tract-based data, but you can start to build a picture of, for example, which tracts have homeless shelters in them and perhaps the capacities of those homeless shelters. You may be able to use the data provided by the continuum of care organizations to understand what proportion of the total homeless population of a city or county or metro area could be found in those shelters. So that would be the start that I would suggest.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. The next question is, are you aware of the options tab in the data table and below that the filter tab that are available in the Roam tool?
That's right. I apologize if we seem to give short shrift to any of the other tools out there, the Roam tool or the CUNY hard to count map. We have a limited time and there's a lot of functionality in both tools, so we couldn't cover it all. In this case, there are tabs which replicate some of what we demoed in the CIC, the Census Intelligence Center that Civis has put together. So I definitely want to put credit where credit is due. You are able to use filters, for example, in the Roam tool to define a set of tracts and then export data just on those tracts. We feel that custom software can make certain aspects of the analytical process a little easier. And in this case, we think that the Census Intelligence Center has a nice functionality where it will, all in one step, aggregate the populations in these different tracts that you might have selected through your filters and compare that at a glance to the general population. That is definitely something you can do with the data provided by the Roam tool. Our software allows you to automate that process and have it available at the push of a button.
All right, great. Next question is about dual speakers in the household. Is there a way to tell if a household has dual speakers?
Yes, there is. So the underlying data for all of these tools, hard to count map from CUNY, the Census Roam tool, our Census Intelligence Center, relies upon Census Bureau data, usually the 2010 census results in the 2013 through 2017 American Community Survey, or ACS. Dual language households are tracked by both the census and the American Community Surveys. And so you can feed any ACS variable, including whether a household is dual language or not, into the Census Intelligence Center.
Okay, great. Next question is about the low response scores. And the question is, how is the low response score from the census different from the 2010 mail return rate?
Well, the 2010 mail return rate is an actual number. It is the known self-response of those tracts in 2010. The Census Bureau's low response score uses those scores as a starting point. There was essentially a challenge to the data science community to see if they could build models predicting those low response scores. The best performing models were adapted somewhat by the census and simplified into something more closely approximating a linear model. And so essentially, based off of that linear model and some survey research which has been done since 2010, the Census Bureau has a predicted score for 2020. Those predicted scores are going to be different than the 2010 census results, but I have to caution that even a very good prediction is just a prediction. There are a number of unique factors going on for 2020, and we cannot be certain that the low response score predicted by the census will actually be that tract's response rate.
Yeah, and this is Chris Dick from Census as well, and I do want to be clear that the data we're talking about here that are in the Rome tool are the 2010 based models, not the direct predictions that the Census Bureau has internally, which will not be released publicly for 2020.
Thank you, Chris. There was a question in here about how we apply this data to personas so that we can provide the information to our marketing or outreach teams. We can talk about that pretty quickly, but I do also want to restate that is going to be the deep dive topic for our upcoming one. So we will spend an entire webinar on that. But Jonathan, I don't know if you want to just speak to it very quickly or high level.
So, oh boy, I find myself at a loss for like a one sentence description of this. It's worthy of a whole webinar. Defining who these personas are is an interesting but sometimes fraught process. There's a lot of choices in how many groups you're looking for and how you distinguish them. I would be happy to walk people through that in more detail in a subsequent webinar.
Okay, that's fair. So I guess you'll just kind of have to stay tuned for our next webinar. So that is all the questions. Oh, one more. Did you want to
yeah, sorry, I just saw one last question and I wanted to make sure I got to it. Somebody asks, do you track people who travel, i.e. not available during the census period? Civis ourselves, we don't track people. We're relying on the ACS data, on the census data. But I do know that the census does a fairly good job of understanding sort of what the for lack of a better term, like transient population is that might be moving around from house to house. It looks at houses which they know to be occupied but may not have people in them. I don't have the exact variable names off the top of my head for you, but I believe that this could be found through the Census Bureau's planning database, or at least estimates based off of past censuses.
Okay, great. Again, webinar number 3, titled What Motivates or Scares Your Population and How Can You Know? And because it is on Halloween, we couldn't help ourselves, but make sure we had the word scares in there. But we hope you join us for that one. Registration can take place on civisanalytics.com/census. And I want to again thank our speakers, Sherry and John, for a great presentation today. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at the email address marketingops@civisanalytics.com. For more information about Civis in general and the Census Intelligence Center, there's a contact us form on that page as well. And we also have a lot of other content, so I encourage you to check out our website. We have blog posts and white papers. Some of our experts have been participating in census-related podcasts. All of those will be linked to from our website as well. So there's a plethora of Civis expertise